Imagine you're applying to be a coder at Epic Games. You might go to their website, check out their open positions, even filter the job opportunities by the engineering department. However, you might still be overwhelmed to realize that there are literally hundreds of different coder jobs that are currently available by Epic. So in this video, what I'm going to do is give you the tools you need to unpack what each of those job descriptions means and ultimately figure out what would be the right role for you. And it all starts with unpacking just what each of those titles means. Okay, so here is an example job opportunity. This is a job description for the title of Senior Rendering Programmer for LEGO Fortnite. That may seem like a lot, but don't worry. This title follows a pattern that is pretty consistent across different job descriptions within the industry. And so we're just going to break it down piece by piece to understand what each of those terms means. So let's jump into Paint, where I have each of these sections broken down. So basically, there's 4 parts to this job description title: Senior, Rendering, Programmer, and then LEGO Fortnite. We're going to go through each of them. The first one is that first term, Senior. Okay, Senior refers to an experience level or seniority. And within the games industry, the way seniority typically breaks down is you've kind of got a hierarchy, sometimes called a career ladder, which starts at the bottom with the intern. Okay, the intern is somebody who really doesn't have any full-time experience, which means the only thing they've done is other internships or maybe some student work, perhaps on a student game project or something like that. An intern is someone who is probably in their 3rd to 4th year of pursuing a degree, but there are some exceptions, of course, okay? When you first get a job within the games industry, that is typically going to be at a role called an associate, sometimes abbreviated as ASOS. Okay, and an associate is someone probably within their first maybe 1 to 3 years of their career. Of course, there's a lot of exception to these rules. These are just rough guidelines. But again, someone who is an associate is kind of just starting out. They're pretty inexperienced, but they've probably been on, they probably haven't been on multiple game teams. This is probably their first project, or maybe they transitioned in the middle of a project. So they're kind of, less than those 2 years experience mark. The next role is a mid-level engineer. Okay, now this one is a little bit confusing when it comes to the job descriptions, because when an engineering role is for a mid-level engineer, it's actually not going to say any seniority level at all. So if you see Senior Rendering Programmer, that's for a Senior Rendering Programmer, which we haven't gotten to Senior yet, but we'll get there. But if you just see, if that part is missing, if you just see Rendering Programmer, then that means mid-level rendering programmer. So a little confusing, but basically that mid is always omitted in a title, or at least not always, but usually it's omitted within the title of a job description. Okay, so a mid-level is someone who has been around the block a little bit. They're probably someone who has probably released one title, and that means they're at an experience level somewhere between that 2 years to, let's say, about 5 to 7 year mark. Mid-level is someone who's got some experience, okay? They're probably in their first job in the industry, maybe their second job. The next title is Senior, okay? So Senior is someone who has probably somewhere between, somewhere over 5 to 7 years of experience. When you've been in the industry for about 5 to 7 years, you're probably going to be at that senior level. So a senior level engineer or programmer, that's what we're talking about today. This is a senior level role. Well, that is actually a terminal role, which means that someone might spend their whole career as a senior engineer. It's not typical that someone spends their whole career as a mid-level engineer. Pretty much always you'll see someone kind of progress up this ladder, and then senior is where someone might let's say, coast for the rest of their career as a senior. When you become a senior, eventually you're kind of going to be faced with one of 3 choices. Okay, the first choice is the one we already talked about, and that's where you become a senior forever. Okay, that's senior infinity. A lot of people choose to do that. The second option is if you want to take on more responsibility, you can continue down the track as an independent contributor, which means you take on more responsibility, but again, you're just flying solo as someone who maybe has a role in designing the architecture that you're implementing, but you're not managing people. So this would be leading to something called a principal engineer. Okay, and I think it's spelled AL, principal engineer. Okay, so that is kind of, you're going to go the independent contributor route. The third option is to become a people manager. Okay, that's what we refer to people who manage other people. It's called people manager. The reason why it's a little bit of a vague term is because there's many different kinds of people manager, but I'll just draw a little person there. Okay, so that is a people manager, and typically a senior will evolve, right, like a Pokemon, into a role called a lead. Now, there are program managers who come from an engineering background, but typically engineers will turn into leads. A program manager is often a lead, but is often someone who comes from a production standpoint, or is a lead who chooses to then turn into a program manager, completely divorcing themselves from the code and the coding decisions to instead just focus on people management. Whereas a lead is typically someone who does do a little bit of coding, but maybe they spend 75% of their time or more on that people management aspect, which might include, facilitating big decisions with respect to how they're going to implement stuff in the code base, kind of between other senior engineers. If you have a team of engineers, this is going to be led by a lead engineer. Okay, so someone might become a lead really as soon as they become a senior. It's usually a prerequisite that someone has to become a senior before they become a lead. But again, there's lots of exceptions here. And though I did say a senior is typically someone with 5 to 7 years of experience, that might change depending on the size of the company. At smaller companies, you might be able to kind of rise the ranks faster and become a senior a bit earlier on in your career. Okay, now it's rare, but there actually are roles above these roles, okay? So, darn, I guess I need to move my diagram a bit because I've kind of run out of space here. Oh, geez. I just remembered why I hate paint. But we're just going to scroll that down a little bit because there are actually a few roles that might come above senior or lead that we should probably talk about. So if you want to keep going down that independent contributor track, okay, there is a sort of a lead of leads. And that person is called a director. So a director is someone who might manage director. A director is someone who might manage several different leads. So for example, you might have an engineering lead for tools, you might have an engineering lead for AI, you might have an engineering lead for gameplay, and then there might be an engineering director who is in charge of all those different leads. Okay, that role, typically there's only one engineering director for a particular game project, but that director feeds into a director who is not an engineer called a game director. And so that, of course, the game director could be a engineering background person, but typically they're not. Typically, a game director comes from a production or a art background, though there are exceptions. There's always exceptions. But that is what a director is, okay? Similarly, kind of at the same level of seniority as a director, you might have someone continue going down that independent contributor track, and this is rare, but there is a role called an architect, okay? This is pretty rare, but an architect is someone who is above principal. This is someone typically with maybe like 10 or 15 years of experience, a very experienced person who is, again, just he's an independent contributor, but at this point, he's certainly working across teams on sort of big engineering decisions. So that's an architect. And then, of course, there is a lot of sort of miscellaneous positions. There is even a position called a fellow, which we might probably not even worth getting into. But a fellow is someone who kind of operates at a much higher level, and they're kind of there to advise multiple different game teams on kind of technical decisions. Likewise, above director, you might have a role called a CTO. Okay, a CTO is typically kind of the engineering lead for an entire company. The CTO stands for Chief Technical Officer. So again, they're pretty divorced from the day-to-day decision-making of the coding, but this is someone who is, again, going down that people management route from an engineering background, managing just larger and larger teams. So that is essentially what the career progression, what the career ladder looks like for a coder. Okay, with most coders starting around the associate or engineering or intern level, and most coders ending at the senior level, with, of course, lots of exceptions for people who want to go even further, take on even more responsibility. So, all of that description, and we have only scratched the surface, okay? We've only covered the top section here of the title. The next thing we're going to talk about is this next part, which is rendering. Okay, so rendering, what is this referring to? Rendering is essentially, let me just clean my workspace here a little bit. Oh no, I cut off Fortnite. Rendering is essentially the discipline, or I should say the sub-discipline, within engineering. So a rendering engineer works on engineering related to rendering, excuse me. There's lots of different kinds of engineers, but the way that I like to explain it is by thinking about sort of the core competencies of an engineering team. So typically, you've got art, okay, as kind of one of the competencies. You've got design, okay, somewhere in its own corner. And then you've got engineering, okay? And that's kind of its own thing. There's a lot of other roles. For example, there's sort of an auxiliary role, which is, I mean, it's an ancillary role, but it kind of sits outside of this golden triangle, and that would be for production. That one's pretty important. And then you also have quality assurance, which is certainly part of the development team, but again, is typically not within this internal trifecta, let's say, of development. So you've got art. That includes people who create animations for the game. They create visual art assets for the game. They create audio and I guess, is that everything? I guess the visuals, the audio. Is there anything I'm forgetting? Those are all the art assets for the game. Then as a designer, there's many different kinds of designers. There's gameplay designers, there's quest designers, there's narrative designers, there's writers who fall within the design department typically, though sometimes they're in the art department. And then you have engineers, and that's what we're talking about today. But the reason why I draw it in this sort of trifecta is because there are engineers who kind of operate over here, in between design and engineering. Then there's engineers who operate over here, in between art and engineering. And then there's designers who operate over here, solidly in engineering, and they don't talk to artists or designers at all in their day-to-day job. So some example roles might be, you could have a graphics engineer, okay? So a graphics engineer is someone who's typically very concerned with the performance of the game. They're someone who perhaps writes shader code, okay? Though that is, I mean, someone who writes shaders is probably a little bit further on the art side. Or they could be someone who is, you know, just working within the engine, okay? And that starts to head on over here into a engine programmer who is kind of focused on how do we visually display the art that the art team is providing. Okay, then you have people who are in between design and engineering. Over here, on kind of the design half of the picture, you've got something called a technical designer. Okay, similarly, on the art side of engineering, you've got someone called a tech artist. Okay, and so this is someone who knows a little bit about engineering. They might, for example, be proficient in scripting, but typically not programming. And this is someone who works usually on the art team in order to help them solve technical problems. So, for example, a technical artist might be someone who's implementing a lot of the art, for example, implementing the shaders, the graphics, things like that, dealing with, you know, the performance implications of the different materials that have been selected for the game. But they are on the art side, okay? And they might be working with a graphics engineer hand in hand to fix all the performance woes that come with making a modern AAA game. On the design side, a technical designer is someone who is probably implementing a lot of the scripting for things like quests in the game. Perhaps they're also implementing some of the more technical things, such as, you know, within a animation timeline, there might be different events that are triggered by a particular action. So, for example, when you swing the sword, that might trigger a calculation to detect whether or not the sword overlaps with an enemy to apply damage to that enemy. Typically, that kind of setup is done by someone called a technical designer, but again, lots of exceptions there. On the other side of kind of the technical versus the design breakdown here, but someone who's a little bit more on the engineering side, that would be someone called a gameplay engineer. Okay? So a gameplay engineer is, again, in between design and engineering, but they're a bit more on the engineering side. And this is someone who typically is a programmer. So programming versus scripting. Programming is typically one discipline that takes a little bit more experience. Okay? Programmers are typically people who work in programming languages rather than scripting languages. These are people who deal directly with things like memory and performance implications, whereas scripters are usually closer to the implementation side and kind of operate at a higher level. But a gameplay engineer is a role that's pretty near and dear to my heart. This is, in my career, I've had a lot of these roles, but gameplay engineer is usually the one I've worked in because I'm someone who's passionate about design and engineering, but I like to approach kind of games from that engineering background. So a gameplay engineer might be someone who implements the code to expose to designers for them to, tune different player-facing, I guess you would say, verbs. So for example, a gameplay engineer, the designer might come to the team and they might say, hey, we would love to have a system where when a player shoots the gun in our game, well, we might want the gun, instead of doing 5 damage, to do 5 damage over time. And so what a gameplay engineer might do is expose a scripting hook for a ability that allows for the gun to do damage over time. And then a technical designer might implement a script that calls into that programming hook in order to apply that damage over time. And then lastly, a designer might tune the designer-facing tunables, right? These values, maybe they're in a CSV or some sort of editable document, to kind of determine how much we want to deal damage over time. So the engineer is kind of how, and then the designer is kind of like, how much are we going to do of this thing? Of course, there's many different levels to this, but that's really just if you're dealing with a large team. The smaller the team, the more hats that a single person is wearing. And so you might have a technical designer and a gameplay engineer in one. That might just be one person on your team. Or in some indie game development cases, you might have engineering and design completely owned by one person. Okay, lots of exceptions here. But basically, that's a rough breakdown to kind of give you a conceptual model on kind of how do these different positions fit along the trifecta of internal game development. Okay, so that is the second part of the title out of the way, rendering. The last thing to go over, there's 2 more things. The next thing that I want to cover is programmer. So programmer is going to be probably the simplest one that we cover right now, and that's because programmer is just saying, hey, you're a coder. This is just identifying someone as part of the engineering department. Now, sometimes you will see the role engineer. Okay? Oh my gosh, I just spelled engineer wrong. Engineer. Okay, so engineer is synonymous with the term programmer. Okay? It is synonymous. However, in most countries, these are considered distinct roles. It's kind of unique that in the United States and Canada, programmer and engineer is combined. And it's kind of unique within the games industry that a lot of times programmer and engineer is combined. For a bit of background, in the United States, if you would like to become a computer scientist or a programmer, those are the same degree. Now, that's not the case in most countries, but in the United States, those are the same degree. And I think that's the case in Canada as well. So if you want to be a programmer, you're still going to get a computer science degree. Typically, colleges in the United States do not have programmer degrees. Okay? And we can go into a rant about why that is, but it has to do probably with the United States has a bit of a phobia or maybe a disrespect towards vocational work. And so typically universities don't provide programs for vocational work. And so just because universities are offering these engineering degrees, they kind of promote them to being computer scientists. However, it's very rare that you run into someone in the United States who has studied a computer science degree and is actually a computer scientist. In the vast majority of cases, people who study computer science become computer programmers. They become computer engineers rather than scientists. The distinction between engineer and science, or engineering and science, being that science is someone who studies how it works, and engineer is someone who actually implements it. Though, of course, there's overlap, but that's kind of typically how that works. So, yes, that's kind of unique. The United States is one of the few countries that does this. Typically, you have a software engineering degree separate from a computer science degree, but for whatever reason in the United States, they're combined. And so if you come across the terms engineer versus programmer, usually they're interchangeable. Now, there are some exceptions. So, for example, I was early on in my career, prior to receiving my engineering degree, I was studying at university, or actually this was back when I was in high school. I took on a contract to work in Canada as a computer coder, okay? And on my original contract, it said that I was a software engineer, but that was actually illegal. I had to change it because I did not have an engineering degree. And though computer science does not typically have licenses for their engineers, right? Typically an engineer will have a license, okay, to practice their engineering work. Computer science rarely has licenses. It was the case that in Canada, you can't call yourself an engineer unless you actually have a degree, which they kind of use in place of an actual license, okay? Because engineers don't have a board, okay? Which is why engineers tend to do lots of unethical things. But unfortunately, they don't have a board. So the way that worked was I had to change my title from being a software engineer to a software programmer, and then it was suddenly legal, okay? So probably more information than you would ever want to know about the difference between engineering and programming, with lots of opinion, I'm sure, thrown in there for good measure. But basically, if you see a role that says programmer or you see a role that says engineer, for most cases, it's indistinguishable. In some cases, if it says engineer, you do need an actual engineering degree, or it is, you're considered unlicensed, so it's not allowed. But in most cases, being a programmer is just fine. Okay, there was a big court case with Facebook where someone was in Canada and they wanted to say they were an engineer and they weren't an engineer, and it went to court and it was a whole big thing. But blah, blah, blah. Long story short, they're basically the same thing. Finally, the last section of this job title is Lego Fortnite. Okay, and that one's simple enough. Basically, this is just saying what team within Epic Games that you're working on. So in this case, if you are a Lego Fortnite senior rendering programmer, that means you're going to be doing rendering programming at a senior level of experience or seniority on the team that is creating Lego Fortnite. Okay, so now we've gone full circle. We've covered all the different pieces to this job title, and we can go through. Let's look at a few jobs and see if we can kind of unpack what they're doing. So hopefully I've taught the man to fish here, and we have explained kind of all these different components so you can understand what these roles are doing. So here is the first example. This is let's see what this is. This is a senior gameplay systems programmer. So this is a senior level role. This is someone who is probably they're probably at 7 to 10 years of experience as a minimum. There's someone who's working on gameplay systems, which is similar to a gameplay engineer, right? You heard that term before. It's someone who's between design and engineering. But gameplay systems is typically talking about someone who is focused on the long-term or longer-term progression of a player. When we talk about game design, we typically refer to game design with reference to arcs and loops, where an arc is something that you're doing over the long-term experience of a game. For example, player progression, okay, or gaining experience and then unlocking skills within a skill tree. This is something that might happen over several different play sessions of a game. It's your journey, okay? It's your progression. It's your arc as a player. A loop is something that you're doing more immediately. It's something that you're repeating. It's the gameplay that happens again and again and again. So, for example, combat is typically part of the loop of a game. If you are questing, that is the individual actions that you take within a quest are typically part of the loop, and then kind of questing as sort of a meta progression is something that you might consider being the arc of the game. So someone who is a gameplay engineer is usually focused on those loops. They're focused on the moment-to-moment gameplay. Someone who is a gameplay systems engineer is focused on that broad level of experience. They're thinking, what is the player going to be doing on their first hour of gameplay versus their 10th hour of gameplay? What does that progression look like? That's usually what gameplay systems refers to. And then programmer, again, that's the interchangeable one. It could be programmer, could be engineer. It's just saying that you're going to be doing some coding. Okay, typically we don't hear the term coder, okay, or software developer. Typically we don't hear that in game development. We usually just hear engineer or programmer. This next term, R25358, is for robots, okay? This just is a reference to the actual job posting. So if you're saying what specific job are you referring to, this code kind of is a unique identifier for each one of the job postings. So if we scroll down a little bit here, it is saying that the location is multiple locations, and it's within the engineering department. This is all redundant information. So if you're checking out this role, what I would recommend you do is you scroll down, and one of the things you're going to want to be looking at is what kind of languages that this engineer develops in. Now, we are talking about Epic here, so they're probably coding in their own engine. They have a very well-known engine called the Unreal Engine, and that is C++ based. Now, the Unreal Engine does support a scripting layer, which is a visual scripting layer called Blueprints, and that is kind of its own language. But typically, it is a designer who will be doing the scripting, and programmers are, as the name would suggest, they're going to be doing the programming. So in this case, it's very likely that a programmer at Unreal is going to be doing C++ development, because that's sort of the foundational language for all of Unreal's tech stack, okay? That's the foundation for the Unreal Engine. So proficiency for C++, that comes as no surprise. And, lots of other information here that you should probably go into if you're writing a cover letter. Of course, we got those juicy salary details. And I'm actually surprised that they did not give a years of experience requirement, but we'll probably see that come up a little bit later. So that is a gameplay systems programmer. Okay, let's scroll down a bit here and jump into something different. All right, so this is a senior mobile platform engineer, HMI. Okay, I don't know exactly what HMI stands for, but it probably refers to the team if this job description follows the pattern that we've previously gone over. And again, this is someone at the senior level, and they are what kind of engineer? A mobile platform engineer. So that is typically someone who is going to be dealing directly with an iOS or an Android development pipeline, because those are the most common mobile platforms. Okay, so let's jump down here to get a bit more into the details. So again, they're saying the Unreal HMI team. Again, I have no idea what that stands for, so they're a little presumptuous. But it stands for the Human Interface Machine. So you can Google it, and you can look into what the heck that means. Okay, wonderful. So this is obviously a Tesla. So when I said mobile platform, I guess they meant really mobile, as in someone driving a car. So that is what this role is all about. You're probably going to be doing something between the interface of the Tesla. So that's actually quite interesting, because Tesla has traditionally had their own platform. So I'm actually kind of interested in... this might be a new development. You might be working on something quite emergent with respect to the interface between... Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of pictures for Tesla here, so you're probably going to be working on Tesla stuff. So if you'd like Tesla, then this would be a great job for you. Again, but here it talks about mobile as in Android, so I'm not sure. I guess you're doing a bit of everything. And maybe you're working on the SDKs that interface between the mobile platforms and the games itself. I'm not sure, but that is basically what this job's all about. Again, C++, and California and Washington, okay? Typically, if one of these roles supports remote, which I don't think Epic is doing typically, it will say so within the location, but I would generally assume if it doesn't say remote work is supported, that it is not a remote role, and that you're going to have to come into the office, okay? So let's jump into this one, a little bit more straightforward. This is a senior physics programmer, okay? So this is someone who's dealing with the physics systems of a game. Now, physics may refer to a particular game's implementation, but because it didn't list a game team, I would generally assume when we're dealing with Epic that that means physics in the Unreal Engine. So let's scroll down a little bit to understand for sure, but typically physics when it doesn't have a game team, yeah, is referring to someone who's dealing with the physics systems within the Unreal Engine. So this is, again, someone who's dealing with a lot of C++, and here we see math come up. Math and particularly, trigonometry is something that comes up all the time when it comes to game development, particularly physics, of course. And this is someone who, okay, they're being quite explicit here in saying they're looking for 5+ years of experience, which is, again, the marker we typically look to see at, that 5 to 7 year marker for someone who's transitioning into a senior role. Okay, there might be some more information here, but that pretty much covers a physics engineer. Okay, let's keep on scrolling, see if we could come up with something else. Oh, okay, web engineer. So you don't typically see a web engineer embedded within a game's team. So I'm actually curious what they might be talking about. But again, we just follow our pattern. Senior, probably 5+ years of experience. Engineer, a coder, and then web is the kind of coding you'll be doing. So in this case, it is someone who's working with an EOS SDK. No idea what that means. I guess we could Google it. And it's Epic Online Services. Okay, so this is probably someone who is dealing with, I'm going to guess, online analytics for a game. Yeah, so this is the developer portal. So I'm not familiar with what that is for Epic, but it is an online subsystem, whatever that means. So that is what a senior web engineer will do. And if we dive into here, we might also get to see a little bit of the tech stack they're referring to. And sure enough, here it is. You're going to be coding in the languages of React, Node, Next.js, Remix, and TypeScript. Okay, so a lot of these are scripting languages, which you might expect to kind of pop up when you get into the web development. So this is someone who is probably within what you would refer to as the stack. Okay, the tech stack. This is where we start getting into things like front-end engineer, back-end engineer, full-stack engineer. Typically, game development programmers are not even in the stack. It's kind of completely separate distinction, but as you start jumping into web development, you find roles that are within the stack. So when we find the stack, often, those terms of front-end, back-end, full-stack are what we use to refer to someone who's working on one side or both sides at the same time. And in this case, they're referring to someone who is doing AWS infrastructure, which is typically back-end, but they're scaling the entire Fortnite player base. Okay, interesting. So this probably seems like someone who is going to be more on that back-end engineering side. Okay, so let's jump a bit forward here and see what other roles we have. Okay, cool. Senior director. So this is something we covered, a director, right? This is someone who is a people manager. And a senior director, we can only assume, is someone who is a director of great seniority. Typically, you don't have a senior director role, but I guess Epic is so large, they might have to add that extra level of ownership. So a senior director is probably someone who is a very experienced director. And so by adding that senior explanation, they're probably trying to imply that this is someone who I would assume has maybe 10 to 15 years of experience within engineering. And in particular, this is a director who's managing the metahuman team, which of course, we've got a lovely graphic here. This is where you can create, lots of very hyper-realistic models and rigged models for that matter within the Unreal Engine, or it might be adjacent to the Unreal Engine. So let's jump into a bit of the description here and see if they have a little bit more information. So again, here they are saying 10+ years. So previously, when it came to an independent contributor, they had the descriptor senior, meaning 5+ years. However, in the case of a senior director, I had a feeling if they're going to add senior onto a role that's already pretty senior, a director level role, they probably wanted to emphasize that level of experience, and that is the case here. They're saying, no, not senior as in 5 years, senior as in 10 years of experience. And interestingly enough, this is someone who has knowledge of C++, which we would expect, but also intimate knowledge with Python, which is a scripting language. So interesting. That is someone who's doing that. A people manager, probably, but someone who comes at that position with a lot of experience. So that is a senior director. First time we've seen one of those. Let's keep on scrolling. We've got senior engine programmer and then senior full stack programmer. We just talked about that. Of course, full stack here is referring to the web stack. So this is someone who, again, is probably interfacing with some of those technologies we just saw before, like TypeScript and, AWS backend, stuff like that. Is there any other kinds of roles we might pop into here? Hopefully you're gaining some confidence because we are seeing some things that are following up again. Oh, okay, here we have technical lead. So again, we talked a little bit about lead before, right? That is a role that someone might graduate into following a senior level role as an independent contributor. But this is a bit of a short title, isn't it? It's only 2 words, technical lead. So let's scroll down here to see if it might get a bit more specific or if it really is that general. They're just hiring technical leads across the board. You will see this sometimes with companies where basically they have an open job posting that they keep up forever, okay? Because it is so hard to hire top level engineers, especially within the games industry, because it is such a rancorous, mean industry. That, you know what, if an engineer comes along and they are senior level or above and they want to apply, often a team that's as big as Epic would be happy to kind of field that resume just to see what they bring to the table. So let's see how specific this role is. Let's scroll down a bit. So seeing a lot of generic terminology here. More generic terminology. They haven't specified a experience level, but I'm going to assume if it's a lead, then it kind of, like I said, has senior as a prerequisite. So probably somebody who's got 5 years of experience. And yeah, this is a really vague role. So they have not really clarified anything here. This is a very strange job posting, but I suppose if you are someone who just generically wants to lead technical people, this would be the role for you. So weird, very weird, but that's the role. All right, then we've got UI programmer. Pretty straightforward here. This is someone who, I guess, just generically wants to program UI. And again, this is, you'll notice here that it doesn't say associate, it doesn't say lead, it doesn't say senior. So this is one of those examples where we have a mid-level engineering role, someone who's probably 2 to 3 years of experience into their career. But for whatever reason, we cut off the mid-level role. So you just don't include mid if it's a mid-level role. You just say programmer. So that's the case here. It's a UI engineer, or sorry, UI programmer on an unspecified team at the experience level of mid. So let's scroll down here, see if they have any more information here. Again, they are looking for C++ programming, which we expect. I'm assuming that if it's UI, they might even want you to be familiar with Epic's Unreal UI tech stack, which is called Slate. We'll see if that's mentioned here. I'm not sure if it is. It is mentioning Fortnite, so I'm going to assume it is, because of course we know Fortnite is using the Unreal Engine tech stack. And we do not have a seniority requirement here, so there's no years of experience listed. Though I would assume if it is mid, we're looking for probably at least 2 to 3 years of experience. Okay, this is why you just got to know, because kind of sometimes they just don't say. And I think that about covers it. So we've gone through. Of course, we're scrolling kind of ambitiously here. We're jumping around a lot, but we've gone through about 200 different positions covering all the different roles that might come up in your job search. So hopefully this was helpful for you, giving you a bit of confidence when you go into those hundreds of job listings to understand which one's the right fit for you. But if you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to leave those in the comments section below. And if this video was helpful for you, leave a like, hit subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks.